Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this side session as part of the OECD Forum on Due Diligence in the Garment and Footwear Sector. The topic of this session is the interplay of due diligence and upstream circular fashion systems. It's the 14th of February, and we hope everyone is feeling love today or being able to spread love around the world. And today's session is presented as part of the Global Circular Fashion Forum, which is an initiative by Global Fashion Agenda, supported by GIZ, to share learnings and knowledge across different regions on how we can develop circular fashion systems that are really attuned to the global nature of our fashion value chain and the diversity of actors in different regions around the world. You can learn more about the Global Circular Fashion Forum on globalfashionagenda.org. And with that, I would just like to say welcome everyone to today's session. My name is Holly Surratt. I'm the Impact Programme and Sustainability Director at Global Fashion Agenda. As I just mentioned, we're exploring what the interplay is of due diligence and upstream circular fashion systems. And I'll start with an introduction of why we chose those different topics and how we can start exploring what that explicit link is. We don't believe there is currently a real explicit link between due diligence and what's happening circularity-wise. So that's our attempt for today. We hope to explore what positive synergies can be found. We won't have all the answers, but hope this will be a good start to the conversation. Due diligence is a focus as we're part of the OECD Forum, and also because there's a favourable momentum at the political level. If we think back to 2020, a study on due diligence requirements through supply chains was published by the European Commission. And within that publication, they stated that voluntary measures hadn't been sufficiently effective in really encouraging companies to identify, account for, and mitigate negative human rights and environmental impacts in their supply chains. So that publication highlighted the need for an EU-wide mandatory legislation. And fast forward a few years, such legislation is now on the table. This is at EU level and is in the form of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. There's also the extended producer responsibility proposals and other items impacting due diligence, such as the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. I'm very grateful that one of our speakers today is an expert on this topic, Bente Bauer, and she'll be providing a down low on all that's happening due diligence-wise. Why we're talking about upstream circularity. Circularity is one of the main 5 priorities that Global Fashion Agenda advocates for and has been doing so for many years. Back in 2017, we launched a set of circularity commitments, which over 100 brands signed different targets for, looking at circular design, designing out waste, reverse logistics, and so forth. There was a very insightful exercise, and 2 of the learnings that we derived from that commitment was the large gap between brands' commitments to adopt recycled materials in their collections, reducing virgin resource need, and the actual availability of recycled materials. So basically, there aren't enough recycled materials to meet those targets. So that was one of the learnings. And a second learning was that we identified a real focus on a consumer market-oriented circularity approaches. So perhaps circular business models such as rental and resale, and a lack of circular systems really designed from a manufacturer perspective, wherein we'd bring value to different actors throughout the value chain. So that really brings into the 2 different topics that we hope to be talking about today. And we have invited several speakers who are working on circular systems in manufacturing countries. We'll be talking about the Circular Fashion Partnership Project in Bangladesh, which is soon going to be replicated to Vietnam and Cambodia. And a large focus of those projects is valorizing post-industrial textile waste. So really the textile waste that comes from production, and that's large quantities of homogeneous textiles that can be recycled quite easily in comparison to, for instance, post-consumer waste. So we see that as an immediate opportunity because it could be a stepping stone to scale up recycling and really prepare for post-consumer textile waste. Perhaps lastly to say on this topic is that we don't feel that circularity is really being explored from a risk perspective yet. How Circular systems can help reduce negative environmental impacts, but also how they disrupt existing systems and potentially cater for vulnerable workers such as waste collectors or not. So they're the two trends that we're attempting to combine into one discussion. Brands having to work with their manufacturing partners to take care of their environmental and social impacts linked to due diligence, and also the collective responsibility to establish circular systems that benefit all actors in the value chain. If you can't get enough of this conversation, I'd like to mention right now that there's going to be a second session happening at OECD. It's going to be taking place both in person and hybrid on Thursday, the 16th of February at 4:30 p.m. And our colleagues on those panels or within that panel will be talking about due diligence of circular value chains, addressing the risks associated with circular processes. Hopefully this is a good precursor. As you'll notice, you have been muted and are not on camera, as we would like to keep that opportunity to our speakers today. But we do welcome you to ask your questions over chat, and we'll do our best to answer them or to ask them to our panelists, either live or via the chat as well. Perhaps lastly, on housekeeping, we are recording this session and we intend to publish this recording on our website as well. So with no longer ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. And I'm excited because we have an all-female lineup of absolute powerhouses from diverse backgrounds and different perspectives joining us. I briefly mentioned before, Bente Bauer is the Director of Public Affairs at the Policy Hub and will be providing a down low on mandatory due diligence to kick us off. Then we have Cecilia Stromblad-Branston. I hope my pronunciation was okay. And she's the Head of Resource Use and Circular Impact at the H&M Group. They're working on this real holistic approach to sustainability and circularity that has a positive impact on people as well. Then we have Christine Sommer. She is the Coordinator for Environment and Due Diligence at GIZ Fabric and has been conducting research and really connecting different actors across the private sector to solutions in producing countries, such as Vietnam and Cambodia, on the topic of circularity. It's also approaching due diligence from the German Supply Chain Act perspective and seeing how she can support manufacturers in Asia to meet those requirements of due diligence law. And last but definitely not least is Vidya Amrit Khan. She is, amongst a few different roles, the Deputy Managing Director of Desh Garment Limited in Bangladesh, a director at the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Exporters Association, where she's also the head of the Circularity Committee. And we've been partnering with BGMEA on the Circular Fashion Partnership project in Bangladesh, where we see many manufacturers segregating waste for recycling right now. So a huge welcome to all of our different panelists. Before we dive into the panel, I'd like to hand over to Bente Bauer to talk us through mandatory due diligence. Thank you, Bente.
Thanks, Holly, and hi everyone. It's nice to be here and to kick off the conversation today with a brief download on mandatory due diligence. So the GFA team has asked me to just set the scene basically on the discussion that we will also have later on, and to provide high-level insights into what will be required from the mandatory due diligence legislation that we see upcoming. So let me just to start with saying that, of course, this is not a new topic. Due diligence has been discussed in the apparel and footwear sector for quite some time, but so far it's also identified by the Commission, as quoted by Holly earlier. Those efforts have been mostly taking place as either voluntary efforts or front-running member states. And very concretely, so we had, for example, the multi-stakeholder schemes, such as in Germany and the Netherlands, requiring due diligence practices of their signatories, but also there are national due diligence laws in France, in Germany, and again in the Netherlands as well. However, now the EU authorities have also recognized these efforts and are aiming at setting harmonized standards and basically to align all what is already happening, and are developing at the moment a mandatory due diligence law, which is also called the, as Holly said, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or as we say, CS3D in short. So basically, what to expect from that. In February 2022, this proposal was published by the EU Commission with basically setting rules and requirements so that companies have to basically police their global value chains for risks and on environmental and human rights violations. So really the legislation is taking both environmental and social topics at its core. Excuse me for that. So basically what will be required, and some key points in the proposed directive are that companies, first of all, follow due diligence practices and set them also in their own businesses. But also they do have to implement measures to address these risks that they have identified. And I think there's some background noise, so maybe if someone could mute themselves, that would be much appreciated. Then companies are required to take responsibility for those potential risks or human rights and environmental violations they find in their value chains, but also they will have to report on their due diligence activities and again, the measures they have taken. So really following the OECD logic almost of due diligence. One additional point that I think is important to mention is that companies could face liability for failing to carry out those due diligence measures. However, it's important to say that indeed this is just a proposal and it's currently being discussed at EU level. So some of the key points that are specifically sensitive and that now the member states and the parliamentarians in the European Parliament have to negotiate are, for example, are SMEs in or out? Where does the responsibility for companies in their value chain end? And also, to what extent can companies actually be held liable for the sustainability risks and impact in their supply chains? Then just to close the loop here on also for the discussion today, as Holly mentioned, the CS3D is not the only legislation that will impact the apparel and footwear sector, and we have an entire, well, we could call it an avalanche of legislation that is coming at the sector. And I think many of them can be seen as part of the Green Deal and the Circular Economy Action Plan. Important here to mention is, for example, the ESPR, which is indeed setting design requirements for products. What to expect here very specifically is that there could be requirements with regards to the durability of products, so meaning the number of washes, but also certain percentage of recycled content that will be required in products. And as also Holly already identified earlier, this is of course something where the global value chain also truly needs to work together in order to indeed share information, but also make those materials available. Another set of legislation is, among others, targeting waste as a bigger topic, or textile waste. So here, very concretely, we have the waste shipment regulation, for example, which aims at protecting the environment and human health from any adverse impacts that arise from shipping waste. That, of course, also, again, has impacts on how secondary raw materials can be traded in or across the global value chains. Those legislations, even though they're, of course, for the EU and they mostly address companies selling products on the EU market, they, of course, have implications for the global value chain. And again, I think this is where due diligence also comes in, and where the global picture of all these upcoming legislations is important to keep in mind. Just to close on this, well, as I said, this legislation is currently under development. Of course, it is important to really bring also the perspective on what that means for suppliers and how basically information can be shared along the value chain. And due diligence might just be the first step basically in the journey towards also circularity. So I think that indeed collaboration is needed. And I think on that note, I will hand over to Holly to then introduce the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Bente. Very, very helpful to hear firsthand where we currently stand, and I guess a little bit apprehensive to know that we have an avalanche of legislation coming, but that's all part of why we have the OECD Forum to discuss these types of things and part of the conversation today. So thank you for that. So yes, we would like to hand over now to the panel discussion. And we just touched upon who our different panelists are, so we won't go into a second introduction. But I did want to say a huge welcome. I see we have 70 people that have already joined in now live, which is brilliant. And feel free to introduce yourself and where you're dialing in from over the chat. Our colleagues have also shared some useful links to the sessions that are taking place at OECD, where you can learn more information. So we look forward to hearing from you there. Then I would like to invite our wonderful panelists to turn their videos on and to unmute. And we'll see if we can, let's see, pull you all up onto the screen. 1 second. Okay, great. Well, we will start. We might switch screens around. Thank you for bearing with us. And as we've heard a bit now about the due diligence and everything that's underway legislation-wise, wanted to start with a question to you about why it's so important and what opportunities you've identified to really develop these upstream circular fashion systems that we talked to in the introduction. And if I may, I'd like to start with a question to Vidya and ask how you have been interpreting that within the work you're doing in Bangladesh.
Hi, Holly. I think my video needs to be turned on by you.
Yes, there we go.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. So as you've already sort of, given an idea of circularity and the whole industry and how it's taking place. In Bangladesh, of course, we're the second largest producer of garments in the world right after China. Although there is a big gap between the numbers that China produce and the numbers that we produce. But having said that, I think what we have with Bangladesh in the last 10 years, what's developed is that the number of green factories is now up to 187. So, and I think 8 of the 10 most green environmental factories in the world are in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is in a very interesting place since the Rana Plaza incident, which of course this year will be our 10th anniversary. But since then, the good work that we have done within the industry is that we've become more transparent. We have a huge number of contracts, MOUs, understandings, associations with people like the GFA, with UNIDO, with looking at all the SDG goals. We look into becoming more and more environmentally friendly every day. And the most important thing about Bangladesh and the garment industry is the transparency. And with the transparency, I talk not only about the manufacturing process, but also about the human rights factor, fairness at work, gender equality, and most of the factors of the ESG, the environment, social, and governance that we are now looking into as the industry as a whole. Of course, I represent the BGMEA, and the BGMEA is an association, and it operates in 3 ways. So we do policy advocacy, we do research, and then we target projects with which various countries, buyers, other platforms, where we enact what comes out of the research work that we want to do. At this point in time, of course, circularity is now a big topic because sustainability is very important to everybody in Bangladesh. You were recently at the Dhaka Apparel Summit. You have participated in some of the sessions, and you have seen how much importance we are giving to garment production in Bangladesh. As far as circularity is concerned, and yesterday, I personally went to visit a recycling plant that is just outside Bangladesh, just outside the capital city. And it was my first-hand experience at visiting a recycling plant, and the numbers, the figures, what they were doing, the way it was set up, blew me away. I think for those of you here, you're probably familiar with the company Recover, who works, they're a Spanish company, and they work to recycle basically from the fabric, the cut pieces, the wastage, which we call informally in Bangladesh, the jute, back into fiber. And this is the first of its kind that is been set up in Bangladesh. The company very proudly said that they are one of the largest recycling plants in the subcontinent. So definitely within India, Pakistan, Cambodia, Vietnam, all our neighboring countries, I think what we have set up here in Bangladesh is huge. So from right before COVID happened in the last two years till now, we have made huge progress as far as circularity is concerned, as far as recycling our garments is concerned. And we have also signed up with projects, one with UNIDO, which the GFA is also a part of, whereby we are going to take 3 years to implement the concepts and ideas of circularity, share knowledge within the manufacturers, come to the best arrangements that we can with the brands, and of course include other policymakers so that the country as a whole can work towards becoming more and more circular. The other project, which is also of importance, is the CREATE project that we are also, that the BGMEA is also signatories of. And within this project, which is a 5-year project, the whole idea is to go in-depth research about circularity, about circular fashion systems, about due diligence, about how the laws will impact Bangladesh, our recyclers, our exporters, and overall come to a conclusion so that over time, Bangladesh, before other neighboring countries who are also garment producing countries, we become the most circular as far as recycling is concerned. So, of course, the numbers that are there is that, you know, out of all the wastage that happens now, 60% is exported, 10% is recycled within the country. Sometimes they say 10, sometimes they say 20, and the rest of the 20% is pretty much lost in the system. If we started to recycle the 60% that we export, I think we would save about $500 million worth of imports of virgin cotton into the country. So the figures are huge. The impact is also huge. But as we go along through this session, what I will be able to explain to everybody is that Bangladesh remarkably has done amazingly well in jumping ship, getting on board with this whole circularity program. And we work very closely with the GIZ also. So we are working together to understand the due diligence laws that are going to come about in the country, and the data, the sustainability indicator data collection. You know, now there are a lot of, like I've said already, that there are 187 factories that are green, but we do not have necessarily in a database all the information in relation to how much carbon dioxide they're saving, how much water they're saving, and pretty much what's going on in general. So what the BGMEA will do in partnership with the GIZ is to set up a due diligence unit. And this unit will have an operation twofold. One, it will be about explaining pretty much across the board how and what the due diligence laws are, how it will impact us, what repercussion it will have on our industry, what will be allowed, what won't be allowed, etc., etc. And the second thing, which is the more vigorous concept or idea that we have, is that we want to start collecting data of all the member factories of BGMEA, which is up to and including almost 4,000 factories. So you will have real-time data about the water that's being saved and the carbon dioxide that's being used, etc., etc. So over time, we welcome, Bangladesh always welcomes, the BGMEA welcomes, the industry welcomes more regulation in certain ways, because we feel that we are far ahead of the game. Since the Rana Plaza incident happened, we've learned from the tragedy, and going forward, we just want to become more sustainable, gender equality, more human rights impacts, childcare, all of it, and integrate it into this industry, which is 85% of the foreign exchange earner for the GDP of our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vidya. And you actually touched upon quite a few different topics there, from both what the opportunities are for circularity in Bangladesh, how you're working on it, but also the potentially positive impacts that come forth from that, and how you attempt to measuring that and presenting those impacts. So thank you so much. You mentioned the work of GIZ and how the due diligence platform that I'd love to learn more about as well. But I think that would be a good occasion to segue to you, Christine. And I'd be keen to hear again on the topic of what the importance and opportunities are for developing upstream circular systems in the regions that you're additionally working with, and specifically maybe Cambodia and Vietnam.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here. And also thank you, Vidya, for mentioning all the initiatives you're working on. I will focus on the circularity and the opportunities, because GIZ Fabric, the project, is working on sustainability topics in the garment sector in 6 different countries, China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And we started our circularity activities in depth, more in Vietnam and Cambodia, and we conducted some waste stream mappings to understand the post-industrial waste flows. So in Vietnam, for example, we estimated that there are over 900,000 metric tons of textile waste available, and in Cambodia it's naturally smaller because the garment sector is much smaller, but we are still up to 160,000 tons of textile waste yearly. And of course, depending on the structure of the garment sector, this is very obvious, the numbers. But as you can see from the numbers, there is definitely opportunities, as Holly also mentioned in the introduction. So we realize that each country has its different characteristics, and hence it requires very country-specific solutions and business models and approaches to foster circularity. So there is, what we found out, there's not a blueprint that fits all countries, apparently. For instance, in Cambodia and Vietnam, you are very rich in polyester and polyester blends compared to Bangladesh. So Bangladesh has a high circularity in the cotton. But in Vietnam and Cambodia, the composition of the textile waste is much different. So we have to think of other sorting structures and recycling technologies that are needed to foster the circular approaches. Other issues are the structure and formalization of the waste collection and the handling. Whereas in Cambodia, for example, you have no proper recycling infrastructure yet, apart from a few small-scale downcycling for hammocks or mattress filling. In Vietnam, in comparison, you already find larger waste handling companies and recyclers that do fiber shredding, or they use the polyester waste for the plastic recyclers. However, the conditions are very different. So that's where we have to really see where is the business model. In Cambodia, as of now, it looks like that Cambodia could rather play a role in supplying feedstock to Vietnam or Bangladesh, where there is a more advanced recycling infrastructure. But in Vietnam also has the potential to have a more vertically integrated supply chain, where you use it, where you test it in a vertically integrated supply chain. But the biggest opportunities also for both countries economically is that both countries depend very much on imports of yarn and fabric. And by setting up a more recycling infrastructure and circular supply chains and a proper waste management systems, you will not only reduce the waste generation, but you also increase the recycling, but also very important, you can reduce your import dependency of yarn or fabric. So you don't need to export all your fabric scraps if you kind of are able to set it up in these countries itself. So yeah, these are a bit of a sum up of our findings and also the opportunities and business opportunities behind. But we are looking even deeper into it, and we also want to start to connecting all the different recyclers, waste handlers and manufacturers and brands to really test these circular supply chains, or to improve already existing circular supply chains, but they can be even advanced in their technology steps. So yeah, we are working continuously on that topic in these two countries.
Thank you so much, Christine. And it's really interesting to hear about the different types of business models. And I know that ties into conversations that Bea and I have also had about the differences if it's either a vertically integrated manufacturer or recycling facility, of course, the scale of facilities, but also the business model characteristics between the different regions. And I will do a shameless plug here because we're just starting on this work in the regions. And if you are a brand producing in Vietnam or Cambodia, or of course Bangladesh, or a manufacturer based in those regions, or a recycler or a waste handler looking to work in the regions, please reach out to us, because we are developing these programs and would love to engage with you about that. So I'd like to hand over to you, Cecilia. Of course, H&M is working on circularity in different ways, both in your materials, as your business models, take-back schemes, and I'm sure much more. Could you share how you're working with your manufacturers on these topics as well?
Absolutely, and I just want to know you already said that, but as a company, of course, the H&M Group, we're really much focusing on integrating circularity into all parts of our business, both to create scale and to create impact. And I think here we're focusing on every part of our value chain, from how we design and product developing to production, of course, and finally customer use, reuse, and recycling. So it's really kind of taking this holistic approach to circularity when it comes to covering all parts. But our supply chain, of course, is a very important part of that. And having a circular and reverse supply chain where we can optimize resource use and where we can secure that we can circulate these materials at their highest use and value, focusing on recycling. I think this is a very important part on our work on circularity. And of course, here there is a big dependency both on regulations and legislation, and we have a real big dependency as well when it comes to infrastructure and access to feedstock on recycled materials. We also have a goal to use at least 30% recycled materials already now by 2025. So of course, recycling capacity will be key for us to be able to meet these goals. So we're focusing on scaling up the use of textile to textile recycled materials. We're focusing on increasing recycling infrastructure. We're also investing both in innovative materials and recycling technologies, but also in reuse models such as resell, for example. And when it comes to our supply chain, we're working together with our supply chain in a range of different projects and initiatives and programs. And some examples on what we do there could be that we have our waste management program in production. And here we're working with more than 70 of our existing suppliers, focusing on collecting these recyclable textiles and connecting that to the best recycling solution. And here we try to be as local as possible. We also provide training programs for our suppliers on our responsible waste management guidelines. We also provide access to digital platforms where, for example, suppliers can register their waste, and that could be connected to recyclers, and we can follow that and track that from the source to the final product. And as I mentioned, I think one very important thing here is to strengthen and develop the local infrastructure. And that's why we're also part of this project that was mentioned here, Circular Fashion Partnership in Bangladesh, for example, also expanding to other markets soon. Because we need to jointly sit around the same table, I think, to both look at the gaps and how we can solve that, including brands, manufacturers, recyclers, also the informal sector. Another example and a similar project, which is coordinated by Fashion for Good, is that we're part of the Sorting for Circularity project in India. And here we're looking into collecting, sorting, and aggregating of post-consumer textile waste for recycling. A third example is that we also have this joint partnership then with UNIDO that I think you mentioned as well, Vidya, where we're also looking into developing, testing, and scaling innovative solutions for collection, sorting, and recycling, especially then when it comes to cotton and polyester in Bangladesh. And another thing that we mentioned is, of course, we're in the early stage, I would say, also taking the people perspective into account on this journey and this transition to circularity. And I think we see that we have to take this holistic approach, but it's still early days. But we know that this transition will have an impact both on people and the planet. And we also previously participated in the BSR projects, Keeping Workers in the Loop, that shows, of course, that this transition will have an impact on jobs, and it will also require different skills going forward. So that's a few examples on how we're working on integrating circularity in our supply chain.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, and some absolutely brilliant projects that you mentioned, and we've indeed learned a lot from ourselves as well, such as BSR's Keeping Workers in the Loop. And I do believe as an industry, and even reflecting on the projects that Global Fashion Agenda are doing, we really need to see how do we embed positive social impact, but are also aware and start thinking about what the potential negative consequences can be as we start uprooting these systems and designing new systems that we hope bring value to all. So one of the next questions I wanted to briefly touch upon is what the barriers are that have been identified. And this is really a question to Vidya, but also to Christine, because if we all have the ambition, we're talking about circularity, we shared values, we know these big programs are taking place. So are we already there? Or are there any barriers that we need to address, and what could be a collective way to do so? So should I hand over to Vidya first or to Christine?
I'm fine with either.
Perfect.
Okay, so basically, I think in Bangladesh, the main problem is the lack of knowledge. The fact that the jute, we call it jute, which is pre-consumer wastage, post-industrial wastage. It's basically the little cut pieces that come out while you're trying to cut out the shape of the garment. And I think one of the biggest problems that we have, well, it's not a problem. I don't see anything as a problem. We just have to overcome it with policy and regulation and learning and education. So I think what it is that, Bangladesh is a 50-year-old country, and a lot of the systems weren't regularized. And of course, the wastage is not a regularized market. And now that people have started to understand the value that this wastage has, of course, the dynamics are changing. So we have the informal sector, which is literally, local people who are perhaps selling to a bigger party, and then the bigger party is then accumulating more. And then there are these localized depots within Bangladesh who then get all the wastage and they export the 60%. Now, the reason why this is happening is because, nobody taught them that this wastage can actually be kept, recycled, or even sold to a more regulated party who would buy it for a higher price. And suddenly, people like ourselves and Recover and other manufacturers have said, oh, hold on, we don't want to sell it to you. So those informal people who were buying our wastage, suddenly, we're touching upon their income. And that, of course, stirs up a lot of questions as to where it's going, why it's not being given to us, etc., etc. So one thing is that, and this is part of the UNIDO project that we are a part of, is to educate the people, is to make them understand what the jute is, or what the wastage value, what you can do with it, how you can upcycle it, recycle it, put it back into the system. I think once people or manufacturers, and even working with these local collectors, I'm not saying we need to oust them from the system, but we just need to educate them so that they themselves get better value out of the work that they're doing. And it's to educate the manufacturers so they start even with the segregation process of what can be recycled, what can't be recycled, and then to educate the collectors about what the value is of what they're collecting, and then slowly bring about policy changes and regulations which regulate the collection process, the local area process. Maybe you can start, and then finally, of course, we don't want to export our wastage anymore. We want to keep it in country and, of course, recycle it ourselves. Now, the Bangladesh Knitwear Association, just like the Garments Association, has in fact called for a full-on a ban on exports of wastages out of Bangladesh. Now, that might not be something that is good for the industry to begin with, because we don't have enough recycling plants. So, and I think the knit exporters are more loss of words, but I think they're more motivated to bring on this ban only because what Bangladesh recycles now is more knit, not wovens. Then there is the distinction between cotton and polyester, and then there is mechanical recycling and chemical recycling. Now, mechanical recycling is something we have here in Bangladesh already, what's been set up by Recover. But on the flip side, we don't have chemical recycling, and nobody's looking into chemical recycling in Bangladesh, because chemical recycling, the process itself, needs a lot of energy. And of course, we want to use renewable energy in this respect. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So it's about knowledge sharing. It's about making everybody who adds to the supply chain, to make them understand what this happens, where the impact is. And this all is very, very much an objective which by the end of the UNIDO project, the CREATE project, is something that we want to achieve. Now, the UNIDO project is 3 years and the CREATE project is 5 years. Obviously, we're not going to wait for 5 years until we get everything going, but it's an ongoing process. And it's also the other big challenge I feel is the taxation laws that we have in Bangladesh, the import and export laws, because at the end of the day, we don't only want to deal with pre-consumer waste. What we also want to recycle is post-consumer waste. And right now, we don't have any laws in Bangladesh that makes it competitive for us to import secondhand garments within the country and then shred that and recycle that also. So the number of challenges, if you want me to sort of grade it, one, I would say the biggest challenge is knowledge sharing. Once people understand the value of the wastage, I think the informal sector will also break up and try to do things differently. So normally people say informal sector. And I know in a country like Bangladesh, we are graduating from the least developed countries, but cut pieces, this is a business. The same thing happened in Italy 100 years ago in Prato. Nobody wanted to let go of their wastage. So that's a challenge. Knowledge sharing, knowledge base, what can be made use of the wastage itself is a challenge. And then, of course, there are policy regulation challenges, which is something that we have to work on further. And being part of the BGMEA, we are in the perfect platform to negotiate with the government, to negotiate with lawmakers, and to bring about the changes that need to be done to become more circular in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidya. And I know Cecilia already touched upon actually developing the infrastructure and the systems for circularity. You, of course, talked about knowledge sharing and the supportive policies needed, import-export as well. I wonder, Christine, do you have any additions to that? If you look at what you're working on in Cambodia and Vietnam, are there any specific barriers in those regions that we need to be addressing?
Yeah, that was already very comprehensive from Vidya, and we see similarities in Cambodia and Vietnam. I just want to strengthen again the data, the lack of transparent data on post-industrial waste. So to get really the volumes, the composition, and in order to set up the waste segregation and to meet the requirements of the recyclers is so difficult. So you really need some fundamental data to prove that there is this business case. And the other, yeah, and the other one that she already mentioned is like the fragmented and intransparent textile waste supply chain. And in Cambodia also we have a special tax implication. So if you import your fabric duty-free, then you're not allowed to sell your fabric scraps then and make income with it. So there are tax implications on that, which also hinders the manufacturers to properly deal or make business with the fabric scraps. And last but not least, we definitely need incentives to bring in the innovative solution and to bring recyclers from Europe, US, also to Asia. And it doesn't need to be the latest and fanciest recycling technology, although chemical recycling is still in the nascent stage somehow. We also can start with a more simpler recycling technologies that are suitable for the fabric waste flows in these countries. So yeah, we need incentives to bring in the business into the country here and the technologies.
Thank you very much, Christine. So I'd like to, I realize we're already in like the last 15 minutes, so time has absolutely flown by. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what is this interplay. So we have the proposal, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive proposal. I'm sure Bente had that abbreviation. And it's going to be requiring companies to really identify and mitigate these impacts. I'm curious to hear what your views are on the proposal and if you believe it can address any of the barriers that we just talked about or really incentivize circularity. And if we have people listening into the call, what would be your wish list? What would you like to see included into the directive? And perhaps maybe to start with you, Bente, just to hear what your perspective is on that, and if it'd be okay, then bringing you back in, Cecilia, as well.
Yes, of course, happy to kick off. I think one point that would be very important to see strengthened in the proposal, and it's currently also under the discussion, is the focus on a risk-based approach. I think it was also something that has already come up in our discussion today, but indeed in the proposal as it was published by the Commission, there was no prioritization of risks, which of course is, well, a magnitude of risk you can of course focus on, but maybe there are more salient risks and risks that are important to address first. And specifically in the context of the discussion we're having today, I think that is also true that you need to start with maybe the biggest barriers, the biggest challenges, and then you can focus on other things as well. So that would be one point. The other point, again, I think there is a true link between due diligence and circular economy, is that with this avalanche of legislation that I've mentioned before, of course, there's also the need to make sure that those are not seen in isolation, but actually addressed in a harmonized way. So there is an interplay between all these different pieces of legislation that will require reporting, data gathering, information sharing along the value chain, and let's make sure that it's not a burden for companies, but also for manufacturers elsewhere to basically just to cater to all these different information requests that they will receive, but really move in one direction and make it most efficient as possible. So harmonization and indeed the risk-based approach would be the two key points.
Thank you, Bente. And do you feel is there going to be a harmonized reporting framework in some way, or do you feel that existing sustainability assessments would be able to cater to this need, or isn't it just there? Yeah.
There is, to come with another abbreviation, the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is indeed also, again, at the intersection of the Due Diligence Directive and all the other files, because there is so much overlap. So indeed, the EU is working on this harmonized approach specifically when it comes to the reporting. But I think there is more that can be done, and that would also ensure a more efficient and effective legislation moving forward.
Okay, so we have a topic for our next webinar, I think. Thank you. And Cecilia, could you share what your perspective is on the current proposal and what you'd like to see included, if that differs at all from what Benton said?
Yeah, no, but I think, of course, we hope that this will bring further awareness, and that will also lead to more aligned efforts towards addressing the social and environmental risks. And I mentioned a bit about our kind of new focus on also bringing the people perspective in. And I think this is a good potential to actually drive an inclusive transition to circularity if it's implemented properly. And of course, it needs to be combined with a holistic approach to circularity, climate incentives, investments, resources. But we think that from a people perspective, this could really serve as a foundation to secure that people don't get left behind, and that we can create a circular industry where the protection of human rights is actually the norm. But of course, at the same time, it's very important that it recognizes the need to think innovative and to find new solutions. So I think, yeah, it will definitely have a positive impact from that sense.
And I'm wondering, so now if the proposal or the directive would have the potential then to put like people first, or to at least balance the approach, if we flip that question around to how can circularity, or the work that both you are working on at H&M, the BGMEA are working on, GIZ, all of these other organizations, how can circular systems help mitigate environmental risk or human right risk? And opening the floor, if Cecilia, you'd like to respond first, or anyone else.
Maybe I can start, as I was on the roll here. But I think when it comes to mitigating environmental risk, I really think circular economy is a key tool actually to mitigate these risks and to secure that we eliminate waste and pollution, design out flaws in the system, or that we circulate products and materials for reuse and recycling, will really, of course, lead to resource reduction on natural resources, but also a decreased environmental impact and yeah, decreased pollution, so to say. And as an example on the social risk side, for example, sectors like waste picking and handling of waste. I think we've been talking about that a bit before here in this panel as well. In general, they are very informal and intransparent sectors. So formalizing these sectors can really support the well-being and health and safety of the workers and protect workers' rights. And we also see that there could be a big opportunity actually for new jobs to be created as well, and for upskilling of workers.
May I?
Absolutely.
So Cecilia, you will be happy to hear that yesterday when I went to visit the recycling plant, they were saying that one of the ways in which they've been able to onboard the informal waste collectors is by saying that, because normally they're collecting and then they're just dumping into a warehouse, and some of these warehouses don't even have washrooms, for instance. So they have actually told the waste collectors that we'll build toilets for women within the waste collecting segregating facilities, and then you give us our wastage, your wastage. So that's already having a very informal positive impact. But where I want to come in from is that, you know, there has to be, for us to become circular, for an industry to completely change the way in which it operates, looking into the environment and the human rights factors, brands have to promise that they work together with the manufacturers, that they work at length with the manufacturers. It cannot just be one season on, one season off. There has to be more of a partnership going forward, because Of course, the textile industry is one of the most polluting industries in the world. And fast fashion has not done anyone any good in the long run. It's not going to either. So there has to be more integration, like H&M partnering up, like Bestseller partnering up. Brands have to commit to this partnership long term. They have to work together with the factories. Their rejection ratio, which they, sometimes there are inspections, and these inspections happen at different levels. This is another place where huge wastage happens. There's a quality problem. And sometimes the quality problem is just a shade darker, or one button moved to 2 millimeters on the right, and the whole stock lot of garments just gets rejected. This happens with everybody. But then normally this flaw is not even visible to the naked eye of the person who's walking into a Zara and buying something, for example. So there are various, and then of course you have to incentivize those manufacturers who are willing to go through this entire process of circularity. Whether the factory themselves does a forward-backward linkage and does a whole vertical integration of being circular or not, even if a factory is segregating the waste and putting it on a formal platform and can give the data to the brand that, look, this is how much I saved, this is how much I got rid of, there must be incentive. What is killing Bangladesh and what will further kill another country, and God forbid, another tragedy like the one we had in a different country, is this price war. Brands are constantly pushing us to put the price down. So on the one hand, you're talking about improving the lives of the workers, but on the other hand, you want to pay us, not you, Cecilia, but brands in general, want to pay us what they paid us 10 years ago, not taking into factor the recession that is coming about, not post-COVID, not inflation, nothing. The compliance is another wastage of resources. Each factory is getting audited so many times, multiple times. There should be regulatory bodies that says, okay, fine, for Europe, this, for the US, this. Make it country-wise even, but not to have multiple from the same country. On the brands, they're all fast fashion brands at the end of the day. If you want to give value to the lives of the workers, the entire chain of production and supply chain has to be sustainable. And it's not just circularity. Circularity is just a part and parcel of this whole war that we're going to try and win against how much the textile and the garment industry pollutes in the world today. So,
Vidya, sorry. So just to jump in there, do you see solutions being converged assessments, for instance, and like collaboration around purchasing practice requirements or code of conducts? Do you see them almost as criteria before to start on circular system approaches?
Oh yes, there are. Of course, there are member partner brands who are very much in on this circular project and program, and we appreciate that. Cecilia here is witness to that on part of H&M. But at the same time, it sounds very good. Oh, we're circular, we're recycling. But then, oh, we'll still give you the $1 that we used to pay you 5 years. That's not sustainable. So there are brands who are bringing about changes. There are brands that are incentivizing. There should be, as far as the EU policy framework goes, Bangladesh is graduating from the LDC status, so we are going to get our GSP taken away. And what we want instead is that if we are so green and one of the most green factory manufacturing countries in the world, we must be rewarded for this also, as opposed to another country who might not be green at all. So we would like that on behalf of the BGMEA, on behalf of the manufacturers in Bangladesh, I would also like to state that we must be incentivized. There must be an upcoming EPR financial incentives that are brought onto this industry so that we get rewarded for the work that we do. And then we will have more circular.
I'm sorry, we're at time, so I do have to stop you there, but I think a very clear call out that you have to have that basic basic need met before we carry on with all of these different developments as well. And Cecilia or any of the other panelists, feel free to respond before we go into the last few seconds. And otherwise, thank you so much.
I know time is up, but of course there needs to be incentives. It needs to be a holistic approach, not only zooming in on circularity or social perspective. I think it's the combination of them all that will make the difference here. So, yeah, the good points, Vidya. I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, a huge thank you to the panelists. We could have definitely have had a lot more time. Thank you for everyone dialing in today. We'll be making the recording available on our website. And I just wish we had more time with you because I think we could have delved a lot more into this topic. Huge thanks to Bente, Vidya, Cecilia, and Christine. I'll skip the key takeaways for now, but do want to flag that this conversation will be more or less continued in a slightly different form on Thursday, the 16th of February, 4:30 to 6 p.m. Central European time. That's in OECD Conference Center room CC4, or you can also dial in online as well. And they'll be talking a bit more about due diligence of circular fashion value chains and the risks associated with circularity. The Global Circular Fashion Forum, again, is a new initiative by Global Fashion Agenda together with support of GIZ, and we'll be really looking into the global nature of circularity and how we can ensure we're distributing value equally across the value chain and designing circular business models from a manufacturer perspective as well. So hopefully in the next meetings, we'll be able to more clearly address Vidya's concern clearly raised. Learn more on globalfashionagenda.org. And thank you again so much for being here. And we hope you have a fantastic rest of the OECD Forum. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.